A beautiful French chateau with a grim past.
This castle's glory was born out of deceit and treachery.
In Kansas City, America, a gloomy-looking structure, once a beacon of hope.
It was a remedy to the racial injustices that were going on.
An isolated settlement off the coast of Ireland.
There was no local doctor, there was no priest, and the government even refused to install a telephone line.
And an out-of-this-world site in Turkey, built by sheer ingenuity.
A lot of resources were spent to create these beautiful spaces, hundreds of feet above ground.
Decaying relics. Shadows of lost worlds. Ruins haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In the heart of France's Loire Valley, to the southwest of Paris, is a fairy tale structure with a dramatic story to tell.
I feel like I've been set down in the middle of the Magic Kingdom.
It's beautiful and utterly captivating. It's like this mix between Angkor Wat and Disneyland.
This region is known for its sprawling chateaus, but none look quite like this.
It's not the standard version. Most of them are very, very symmetrical. This one is fun. It sits in the middle of a lake, a deliberate lake, and it makes the castle look like it's floating. It's a really clever architectural trick.
Yet the days of grandeur are now a distant memory.
The roof's gone, and there's vegetation crawling its way through all the windows and along all the walls.
But behind this glorious chateau is a tale of treachery and deceit.
Its owner was labelled a traitor by France's most notorious king.
But his fall from grace was the making of this fantastical place. The Loire Valley is famed for its extravagant castles. Centuries of aristocratic wealth meant that opulence was the norm here.
Here we are in the garden of France. The climate is perfect. It's not too dry, it's not too wet. It's this wonderful, lush kind of setting. And why not have a chateau here? Indeed, why not have many chateaux here?
Alors ici, on est au cœur de la campagne française, tout au bout de la vallée de la Loire, puisque tous les grands rois de France aimaient à venir ici passer un moment au frais, près du fleuve.
When Roman de Lume first came here in 2017, he was instantly struck by the majestic charm of this rundown ruin.
Moi, je suis tombé amoureux du château, en fait. Entre l'eau, le château, la nature, on vit quelque chose. On sent qu'il se passe une émotion ici.
Château de la Motte Chandelière dates back to the 13th century, a time when powerful kings and queens ruled the land, and long before the horrors of a bloody revolution.
Donc là, on se trouve sur la partie la plus ancienne du domaine. On voit le grand mur de douve monumental qui encercle le château de la Motte. Et en face de nous, les parties vraiment les plus anciennes du château, ce sont les vieilles cuisines médiévales.
Over the years, the chateau has changed hands many times, and so has its appearance. Its most notorious owner was François de Rochechouart.
He's one of the great nobles of the 17th century in France, quite close to King Louis XIII, the father of Louis XIV. and thick as thieves with the ruling elite in France at the time.
Francois is captain of the king's bodyguards, so he's responsible for the royal family's safety and protection.
But at the start of 1643, the sudden death of the king sent shockwaves across France.
The death of Louis XIII brings about great political unrest. They're in the middle of the Franco-Spanish War, and a change in leadership at this moment is absolutely catastrophic. It turns politics into turmoil.
The new king, Louis XIV, was just 4 years old. So his mother and her advisors took control. They soon raised taxes to cover the escalating cost of the ongoing war with Spain.
This provokes an uprising in France of the leading noble families, the merchant class, and even just ordinary people in the big cities like Paris against the regime, rebelling against these tax demands.
1648 marks the start of a series of small civil wars, collectively known as the Fronde.
And during the Fronde, Rochechouart falls under suspicion of agitating against Louis XIV, and so he's imprisoned by order of the king for 2 years.
When he was finally released, Francois de Rochechouart, now exiled from Louis's royal court in Paris, retreated to his family's dilapidated castle here in the Loire Valley.
Originally built as a hunting lodge, a fortress, it's been pretty much disused for 2 centuries. But he sets about transforming it into a Renaissance palace.
And to make up for his dramatic fall from grace, he creates his own court to overshadow the king's.
En fait, ici, on se trouve dans la cour d'honneur du château de la Motte-Chandelier. Et ici, il faut imaginer François de Rochechouart accueillir ses invités. C'était un peu ce place to be de la France ici, en tout cas ceux qui étaient contre la monarchie. C'était finalement le lieu de réception de tout Paris.
Extravagance and indulgence were the order of the day.
Alors ici, c'est un peu le poumon du château de la Motte-Chandelier. Et quand je dis poumon, c'est parce que François de Rochechouart adorait recevoir. On peut imaginer ici une trentaine de domestiques, jusqu'à 80 invités. Et il y avait besoin de ce grand espace, finalement, pour pouvoir faire plaisir aux personnes qui venaient passer un moment.
Everything here is designed for hosting. Come experience this place. Here is your room. Here's the ballroom. Join us this evening for this amazing party. It's all about building alliances through hosting and fun.
This was a very decadent period for the nobility. At the time, they'd certainly never heard of the saying, less is more.
This life of luxury had a high price, one that the out of favor de Rochechouart could actually ill afford.
Et donc, il a complètement remanié le château et il vivait dans un train qui était même au-dessus de ses moyens puisqu'il a fait banqueroute à la fin de sa vie et du coup, il a dû peu à peu abandonner le château parce qu'il ne pouvait plus tenir finalement le rythme de vie auquel il prétendait.
Sadly, after its initial moment of glory, the castle moves through different sets of hands and gradually falls into disrepair.
The chateau was left to rot for another 140 years.
Donc ici, à la Motte-Chandelier, il y a 3 grandes familles qui se sont succédées au XIIe siècle.
Inspired by the romanticism of the most beautiful castles of the Loire, they transformed the chateau once again. But in the end, a tragic event led to the destruction from which it would never recover.
A devastating fire in 1932 broke out from a new boiler, destroying huge parts of the chateau.
13 mars 1992, un dimanche, le baron Lejeune, qui venait de faire changer sa chaudière, a vécu la mauvaise expérience de voir cette chaudière prendre feu et un incendie gigantesque s'est déclaré dans tout le château de la Motte-Chandelier. Et en 1932, forcément, les moyens des pompiers de l'époque n'étaient pas aussi puissants qu'aujourd'hui. Et malheureusement, le château a brûlé.
The next chapter of the fairy tale castle is only just beginning. When Rahman first came here, the ruin was scheduled for demolition. He had 80 days to save it.
Moi, je suis un des fondateurs d'une jeune startup qui s'appelle D'Artagnan et qui a eu l'idée, fin 2017, de proposer aux gens du monde entier d'acheter collectivement le château de la Motte-Chagnon.
40,000 people from all over the world invested in the rescue project. Now, the chateau's doors are open once again.
On a eu la chance d'accueillir, depuis notre première saison touristique, plus de 45 000 visiteurs. On espère monter comme ça progressivement et devenir, espérons-le, peut-être un des châteaux les plus visités en France dans les années qui viennent.
You can imagine Francois would be pretty pleased to know there's that level of interest in his pet project.
In central Turkey is a peculiar-looking cliffside full of strange shapes and striking rock formations.
This place looks almost like an alien landscape. You have these towers of rock. You have areas that look almost like sand dunes with holes in them. It's a really bizarre, otherworldly landscape.
When you get closer, you realize you can actually get inside these caves. They were put there deliberately, and there's little signs of civilization. So these caves were intentionally built hundreds of feet off the ground.
Some caves hold clues about their purpose, and several have their stories painted on the walls.
People clearly put a vast amount of time and skill into beautifying and decorating these places, even though they really are in the middle of nowhere.
We're in modern-day Turkey, which has an incredibly long history, but also a major impact on the world.
This is a parched land, very dry, very hot. You have to be really determined if you want to live here.
Ortaokul yıllarındaydım işte. Yaklaşık 11-12 yaşlarındaydım. Burayı ilk gördüğümde, öğrendiğimde.
For the past 20 years, Mehmet Akiz has been documenting the rich history here.
Oldukça. Çünkü burada kaya oyma mekanların arkalarında büyük değirmen taşı ebadında devasa taşlar vardı. Onları kapıların arkasından yuvarladıklarında ve bir kilit vazifesi yapan duvarın içine açtıkları yuvalara yerleştirdiklerinde dışarıdan herhangi bir gücün bunları açması mümkün değildi.
Dwellings like these were dug into the rock out of fear.
The caves were simple. Small shelves provided places to sleep. And one room was dedicated to a new religion.
Burası Hristiyan müminlerin ibadet etmesi için yapılmış bir mabettir. Mabet olarak kullanıldı burası.
When these structures were built, they were part of the enormous Roman Empire.
In the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf. The new religion of Christianity was outlawed.
If you were caught by a Roman soldier speaking about your God and his son Jesus, you could be forced, upon pain of death, to renounce your religion. You could be arrested. We've all heard stories about Christians being fed to the lions.
As a result of this brutal treatment, Christians made their way to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. But even there, they weren't safe.
Dönemin Roma pagan inancı hala onların peşindeydi. Zaman zaman Hristiyanlara
zulmediliyordu, işkence yapılıyordu, hatta öldürüldükleri bile söz konusuydu. O sebeple yüksek bir yere korunaklı bir şekilde yapıldı.
If the Romans had found a Christian church like this in the 2nd century, they would have razed it to the ground, and they would have had all the Christians inside executed.
But this particular church was built by none other than the Romans themselves.
Christianity became more and more mainstream. By the 4th century, for the first time, a Roman emperor, Constantine, converted to Christianity.
The legend says that Constantine was baptized on his deathbed. Soon afterwards, Christianity was made legal in the Roman Empire.
Evet, bu dönüşüm Hristiyanları çok muhteşem bir rahatlamaya sevk etti. Çünkü o zamana kadar bütün Hristiyanlar takipteydiler.
Suddenly, the Christians in Cappadocia could come out of hiding. They didn't have to worry about the Roman soldiers anymore. They could rejoin the rest of Roman society.
But Cappadocia wasn't abandoned. Instead, they dug further into the rock.
Bu küçük şapel, kilisenin aslında orijinini, başlangıcını ifade eden, onu gösteren bir yapıdır.
Much of Roman Cappadocia has been damaged or looted, but one church has been preserved.
Buradaki kaya oyma mekanlar, yani bir tür mağara olarak düşünebiliriz elbette bunları. Kuş dışkılarıyla kaplanmış. Guano katmanları burayı kapladığı için burada ciddi bir koruma sağlamış.
Guano formed a hard armor over elaborate frescoes, preserving them almost as they were more than 1,000 years ago.
You can see that they spent a lot of resources on the church. They used expensive blue pigment in the painting and even real gold. After a couple of centuries of oppression, this was a golden age for Christianity.
But 300 years after Rome made peace with Christianity, Cappadocia came under attack again, but this time from a new direction.
The new force was the conquering Muslim empire, which had expanded out of Arabia in all directions.
For 300 years, Cappadocia was caught in a battle between East and West.
During the invasion, the Christians went back underground. Some of them literally dug an underground city, but that's another story.
In the 11th century, an army from a Muslim people called the Seljuks marched into Cappadocia.
When the Muslim armies arrived, there was tension and conflict initially, but the Christians weren't wiped out, and over time, the two peoples grew and lived together in this region.
Her İslam ordusu girdiği ülkelerdeki önemli yapıları, Hristiyan yapılarını dönüştürür. Fakat burada böyle bir şey yapmak yerine kilisenin yanına hemen bir mescit yapmayı ilave etmişler, düşünmüşler daha doğrusu. İşte bu düşünce belki de Türklerin bu bölgedeki Hristiyanlara karşı olan iyi niyetini gösterir.
For the next 800 years, Christians and Muslims lived here peacefully. But in 1915, Cappadocian Christians faced persecution again.
In the early 20th century, the Turkish government undertook a murderous campaign of eradication against Christians. Today we call it the Armenian Genocide. It targeted Greeks and Armenians, both of which were largely Christian groups.
Many, many thousands of Greeks and Armenians were forcibly deported from the area, and most of them were Christians. There are also accounts of up to 750,000 people being massacred, but that has always been denied by the Turkish government.
The Armenian Genocide marked the end of a 1,600-year-old story. No Christians have lived in the caves of Cappadocia ever since.
These dwellings were still in use several decades into the 20th century. But in the 1960s, 2 people were killed by falling rocks, and the rest of the residents were moved.
Today, Cappadocia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. 600 churches have now been documented, with many more still waiting to be discovered. In Kansas City, Missouri, USA, a stone building stands apart from the metropolis.
This place sits just on the outskirts of the city, and you wouldn't necessarily tell that something important happened here.
Most of the windows are boarded up. If you happen to be able to look inside, you see these stripped rooms. It's clearly been abandoned for some time.
Inside, the building has been stripped bare, but some clues hint at its history.
Everything's been emptied out. There are places where equipment used to be.
The architecture is very basic. There are no frills here. Now, usually that might suggest a government building or a place that was built in a hurry for a desperate need.
Without this building, many of the city's residents would die unnecessarily. Historian Jerry Sanders spent more than 5 years piecing together the puzzle here. To her frustration, she hasn't been able to go inside until now.
It's been closed for 30 years. I can't even express to you how emotional I feel about being inside this building for the first time. But it just pains me that there's just so much, negativity on the walls. It just says, light it up, like somebody wanted to burn down this place.
This was once at the center of a community called 18th and Vine. It was known as the Black Mecca.
18th and Vine is this historic district in Kansas City, Missouri, and it's formed out of Black migration from places in the South, places in the Midwest, and by the early 1900s, it has this amazing music scene.
It's a place where jazz thrived and drew more African Americans into the community. Then, Black culture thrived and expanded there.
In many cases, places like 18th and Vine, places like the Black section of Kansas City, really are places where Black people can organize and feel a little bit safer.
By the 1920s, more than 30,000 African Americans lived around 18th and Vine. But even Kansas City's Black Mecca wasn't exempt from the notorious Jim Crow laws.
It comes from an English actor who used to play to a song called Jump Jim Crow. And he would act in blackface. And eventually that became the moniker for segregation. African Americans were not allowed to integrate anything. Schools, churches, and my favorite, cemeteries. I mean, like, what would a dead Black person be able to do to a dead white person?
Another segregated institution was healthcare. Kansas City had only one hospital for its entire population of Black people. It was called General Hospital 2.
General Hospital 2 was quite literally a hospital that had served whites in Kansas City and then was left once white people got a new hospital that was built for them. It's in effect a cast-off building, and Black people received cast-off care.
For every 10 beds for white citizens, there were just 3 for Black people. But by 1918, attitudes within 18th and Vine were changing.
When the Black soldiers came back from World War I, there was this new attitude that they portrayed, and it was kind of talked about as being the new Negro.
Around 200,000 African Americans were drafted and sent to fight in Europe, with hundreds dying defending their country.
There was a new awareness of how people were being treated, the injustices, inequalities that were going on.
But while the so-called New Negro movement was demanding political equality and an end to segregation, in Kansas City, sick black patients were going untreated. The solution to the problem still stands on 18th and Vine. Erica Bryce is restoring this 100-year-old building.
You see a lot of the original wood in here. You see the newer beams and original beams. So this is wood that is so solid, like literally, they do not make buildings like this anymore. The cost of a building like this, I can't even imagine. When you think you have boards, maybe 1901, well over a century and a quarter, over ago. Still rocking, solid, the floors that you see over there are all original too.
Kansas City had 4 hospitals for white citizens, but the only facility for African Americans was an abandoned, formerly white-only hospital. One man decided he was going to do something about it. His name was Dr. Edward Perry.
Edward Perry is the son of former slaves. He's born in Texas. He excels academically. He attends Meharry Medical College, which is a black medical college in Nashville, Tennessee, and he becomes a medical doctor.
Perry founded the Wheatley Provident Hospital.
This hospital was really filling a void for Black residents of Kansas City, Missouri. And it was really just a Band-Aid at first. It was a single 2-story building that was providing care to people who may not have received care at all or who were receiving substandard care.
As I understand, a lot of these were medical rooms, either examination rooms or rooms for patients. And so this actually building, despite the condition it looks in right now, this is the most solid part of our building, or was.
This was not a cutting-edge facility. They were not operating at the boundaries of modern science. But what they did offer was a capable and compassionate service with a bit of dignity.
Jerry Sanders has collected together stories from former patients, including one who was actually born in Wheatley Provident.
He said that his mother came from St. Louis to give birth to him because it was kind of looked upon really badly that she was a young, unwed mother. So Dr. Perry would accept all patients, regardless of color and regardless of ability to pay.
The Wheatley Provident Hospital transformed the standard of medical care for black people in Kansas City. But the city's most needy patients still weren't being treated, so the hospital commissioned the construction of a second building.
Behind us is the original building that was the hospital in 1918, and we've now re-entered the side that was built in 1924 as part of the model children's ward.
In 1925, they built a whole new wing to take care of children's needs, a pediatric wing. They called it the Mercy Ward, and the Mercy Ward was a major game changer, not only in terms of offering pediatric care, but also training for nurses and doctors.
And so we have a few photos where you'll see some ads for some nurses, where they're looking for nurses, and you'll see some children sitting on some beds and whatnot. That was in this room. And so if you can kind of imagine kind of like a nursing station back here, probably some sinks or something like that, and beds.
The remodeled hospital was also a shining example of social equality.
So you have 2 white women, doctors. This is 1924, 1920s, right? Early 1920s. And you have 2 African-American doctors. And you have this organization who come together to provide quality health care for all children. That level of equality was revolutionary. To see the humanity in each other and work with each other like that, that was actually pretty revolutionary. And so what makes it so special to me.
For 50 years, Wheatley Provident Hospital took care of children and adults in the African American community here. But inevitably, it eventually reached full capacity.
Wheatley Hospital could no longer accommodate the number of patients that were coming in. So in 1972, they built Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Hospital.
That same year, Wheatley Provident Hospital closed its doors for good.
It may sound like a sad ending for Wheatley Provident after it did so much for the community, but it plastered over a major social injustice. And when that injustice was corrected, Wheatley Provident graciously retired.
Today, Erica Bryce is helping to restore the Wheatley Provident Hospital to make it the center of 18th and Vine once more.
We do have some super strong visions for what happens next, but it's also critical to us that this is also an economic generator. We don't want to just be pretty to look at. We want us to continue to be a functional source.
And for Erica, this is much more than simply a job.
This is not for the money. There's a lot easier ways to make money. You do this because you have a passion for preserving this asset. And so my nieces and my nephews and my family members to come and Kansas Cityans to come can also participate in this building.
These institutions like Wheatley Provident that were born out of segregation, in many regards with the activism done to dismantle segregation, many of these institutions became temporary, but they served a tremendous service. These were institutions that served a crying need and were game changers.
Off the west coast of Ireland, a marooned outpost bears traces of a hardy people.
You can look out to the sea, and in the distance, you see a rugged-looking island. Out here, you were completely alone, with nothing but your faith.
Dilapidated, weather-worn buildings hug the landscape.
Roofs and walls are crumbling and collapsing in. There's slate and timber all over the floor. They're in complete disrepair and surely have not been lived in for many years.
There are few hints about what went on here.
This small, defunct pier shows us some of the things that the people must have done in their daily lives. But it's out there with the ocean and showing that everyday danger that they must have faced as well.
But there was something much more mystical about this place.
If you look beneath the crumbling rocks, you'll see centuries of history revealed.
But what was this place? Was it an ancient Roman mining town? Was it the remote fortress of some band of knights? Was it the kingdom of some obscure Irish prince?
What tragedy left this tiny place deserted? Situated 5 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean, this is Inishark.
Getting to the island is difficult. There's no natural harbour. There's a pier there that was badly damaged with storms and never got any repairs done to it.
Local archaeologist Tommy Burke has been fascinated by the island's ghostly houses since he first came here as a child.
It was actually quite eerie. All the houses were in disrepair, but some of them still had a lot of evidence of habitation. You could still see the different colour paint on the wall. Walking around, you felt you were intruding on somebody else's life.
Tommy knew that a tough community still lived here during the first half of the 20th century, so he set about searching for former members. 75-year-old Martin Murray was born and raised on Inishark, and he remembers a frugal childhood in his family home.
This is the kitchen of the house here now, you know, and that's the fireplace, and that's where all the cooking was done. And the table was here, chairs and everything, and we all sat around, and that's where we all had our meals and all that. This is the room that I slept in, and my bed, I'll never forget, used to be over here. going that way, you know. There used to be mantelpieces across there, and we also had an open fireplace in the room.
But what drew families like Martin's to these shores? Inishark's glorious isolation has attracted religious pilgrims for more than 1,000 years.
The land was both a humble sanctuary and a cultural vanguard that attracted people from around the world. Holy men who came here felt that they were closer to God than those at the center of civilization.
Archaeologists like Tommy believe that a Christian community was established here as early as the 6th century. Those here devoted their lives to contemplation and prayer in these tiny stone-built cells known as clochans.
This is the beehive, the clochan, and it's the main surviving feature of this period of the Christian community. Originally, it was a place where the monks or the priests would have read their prayers. They would have read the Gospels.
Clochan Leo, as it's known, would once have had a special conical stone roof, kind of beehive-shaped. It was a secluded oratory for private devotions.
Although this is all that remains of the clochans of Inishark, it's clear to see that everything here was part of an important religious ceremony.
Clochan Leo is believed to be the last in a 14-station pilgrimage on the island, representing Jesus' last walk.
The pilgrims would do circuits and stop and pray and say rosaries and spend a day in prayer and in pilgrimage.
Following in the pilgrims' footsteps, Tommy finds further evidence of their life of devotion and faith.
Another station is a Bolan stone, a common feature of Irish monastic sites. The circular depression at the top is often said to be the imprint of a saint's body. And the islanders believed that the water that collected there could cure all manner of minor ailments.
Over the centuries, pilgrims came and went. And in time, the settlement of Inishark grew.
We know from around the mid-1700s onwards, there was a permanent settlement here.
They worked very hard. Many of them were fishers, and they were well known as being these great rowers. Sometimes they would even row out 7 miles to some better fishing grounds.
There was a period in the 19th century that islands were quite a coveted place to live. They were very rich fishing waters. The agricultural land is pretty good, and people came in certain numbers.
A chapel was built here in 1894 and a school in 1898. And for this isolated, sparsely populated area, this was a real building boom.
But despite the growing infrastructure, much still had to be rowed across from the neighboring island of Boffin. One essential import was a priest.
Once a month, a priest would be rowed across the water to Inishark.
Martin Murray recalls his visits to Inishark's quirky chapel.
Remember my mother, she'd be polishing our shoes, she'd be ironing our shirts, she'd be fixing us all and making us proper for Mass on a Sunday.
As you look at the chapel, though, it feels as if there's something missing, and it's not just the roof. For a place of worship, there's nowhere to sit. The women would have had to bring their own wooden three-legged stools, while the men would have just lined up against the walls.
But the priest only came once a month. So Inishark's more devout residents made the perilous boat journey to Boffin for weekly worship.
Life here was incredibly tough. You were really exposed to the elements. So the people would have had to face the harsh, unceasing winds and the driving rain that came in on the Atlantic storms.
Eventually, the treacherous seas around Inishark claimed their victims.
On Easter Sunday 1949, the weather was severe. A gale was blowing and the currents were strong. Most residents decided it was too dangerous to cross to the next island to go to church, but 2 brothers and a cousin decided they would have a go.
The 3 men successfully made it to Boffin, But the storm had worsened by the time they returned.
As they were leaving and coming back, the ocean got them.
I remember seeing all the people crying, and it was a terrible loss to the village. 3 young men in their prime of life getting drowned. Only one of them was found.
The awful event struck fear into the people of Inishark.
There was no local doctor, there was no priest, and the government even refused to install a telephone line.
In 1958, tragedy hit the island again.
One man fell drastically ill when the weather was too bad to launch the boats. Cut off and with no telephone, the islanders lit a bonfire to alert their neighbors on the island of Boffin that they needed help. But their signal went unnoticed.
Trapped on Inishark, the man's prospects looked bleak.
I remember them talking about it the next day. And then they discovered that this poor man had died.
No doctor could get to him. And worse, in the minds of many of the people of Inishark, no priest could get to him to give him his last rites. And this was a kind of a final straw for many of the people of Inishark.
The island's population quickly dwindled, and 2 years later, the government relocated the remaining 23 inhabitants to the mainland.
And the entire remaining population of Inishark departed, with one exception. Thomas Lacey, the father of 2 of the 3 boys that had drowned in 1949, refused to leave.
And Thomas sets his table for one last dinner. And he sets out 3 plates, one for himself and one each for his missing boys. He has his dinner, he prays, and the next morning when the priest comes, Thomas gets on the boat and leaves Inishark for good.
The rocky isle will always hold pride of place in Ireland's spiritual history.
It is important in its own right. It's part of the stitches that make up the whole tapestry. The loss of community was a loss to the whole culture of the coast as well.
The island of Inishark symbolizes joy, symbolizes tragedy, but fits itself in this great museum of Ireland.